So this past week, it shouldn't be a surprise to you that the Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its report on residential schools. For many, this was a long-needed and long-called-for acknowledgement about some horrific things that occurred. Our congregation started its acknowledgement last week with the words of Reverend Alf Dumont, who spoke of the Commission's report and Indigenous, Aboriginal, and First Nations traditions. Now that we have the report, we read it and we look over it and we see for ourselves what hidden truths lay in the past. An unearthing of what was once buried. For some, and I want to highlight that point, for some, this is a victory, a successful moment, a moment of celebration, for acknowledgement. See, any time that silenced voices are heard, we as Christians should rejoice and celebrate that hearing. Chief Robert Joseph, who helped create Reconciliation Canada, and said, I never ever envisioned that this would happen. In audio, while there was a gathering, he said that thousands of people would gather to give expression to the idea that we are all one. Indeed, we are all one. What happens to one of us affects all of us. As much as it's a joyful moment of abuse and horrificness finally on the road to redemption, on the road to reconciliation, some question it. They don't believe that it will actually lead to anything. You see, part of that commissioned report includes 94 recommendations for the Canadian government and Canadian citizens to take. The question is, what will we do next? Cynicism, pessimism runs deep, and people doubt and question if it actually will lead to anything new. So for some, this might be part of the way, but we still have a long ways to go. And so I think to other social justice causes. I think of those who care so intimately for Mother Earth. I think of those who help the poor, who care for the marginalized, who include the excluded, and the burden that it can be to do these acts, to do these ministries. I myself at times feel like giving up. I feel overwhelmed. I feel, what's the point? Nothing's ever going to change. And so I have to wonder, why do we do this? Why do we cry out against social injustices? How long must we do this? How long must we speak out against the majority? How long must we care for those who no one else will? The disregarded, the outcast. Where is hope? And I think that's where we come to our scriptures this morning. You need to know some background information before we get to the actual story. So, for the sake of where to start with our background information, I would like to travel to Egypt, which, if you are a biblical person, you'll know I'm starting with the book of Exodus. We're in 1 Samuel. There's quite a gap there. So, very quickly, in Egypt, the Israelites, a group of people, were enslaved. There was a man named Moses who came and helped liberate them with the help of God. They were liberated. They crossed the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness. Now, because they started worshiping idols, God punished them. So they roamed the wilderness for 40 years, until everyone from that generation, except for a few people, had passed away. And then they entered into what was referred to as the Promised Land. Now, this Promised Land was supposed to be spectacular. It was supposed to take care of everyone's needs. It was the new Garden of Eden. But whenever they went into the Promised Land, first we should acknowledge that there were people occupying that land. So our scriptures, and the Hebrew scriptures, document kind of not so pleasant, somewhat violent scenes of people coming in and killing everyone and taking their spot. So we do need to acknowledge that there's some trouble there, but not focusing on that trouble right now. They lived in the Promised Land. Now, the Promised Land was this block of land in a larger mass of land. So, in that time, it was very common for different nations and tribes to try to conquer other nations and tribes to enslave them, because we want slaves and we want their goods. So there was a lot of battles and fighting occurring at this time. Now, whenever the Israelites went to the Promised Land and had arrived, they weren't ruled by a king. They were actually ruled by what was regionally, by what is called judges. And stories of those regional leaders are recorded in the book of Judges. So now we come to a time where Samuel is the last of these judges. And the neighbors are a threat. You see, up north, we have the Syrians. Syria's up north. Then, to the east, I don't know my directions, but to the east, we have the Ammonites. To the south, we have the Edomites and the Moabites, but our greatest threat to Israel is in the west, the Philistines. There we go, Philistines. They're a violent bunch. And in fact, right before this story gets told, there is a story where the Philistines had the Ark of the Covenant, which, as if you may know, was the presence of God, which was kind of a big deal that the Philistines had this and the Israelites did not. Ultimately, it does get returned back to the Israelites. But the Philistines are still causing trouble. Now, we find in our story that Samuel is old at this point. He has two sons, Joel and Abijah, I think. Name's not my forte. So, these two sons are there. And the two sons are corrupt. They're evil. In fact, so the scripture verse 2, which was not read to you, it says that they were bent on gain, quote unquote, that they took bribes and they let injustices spread. So the people, at least the way the scriptures are presented, are justified by their call for a king. It's not doing it just because, hey, let's get a king because we want to. They're justified. Now, it also should be noted that this story kind of sets the people apart as well. See, in the other kingdoms and nations around the Promised Land, those people had kings ordained by their gods. So it came from a top-down kind of model. Whereas in this story, we see the people going to a prophet, Samuel, and saying, we want a king ourselves. So it's a bottom-up method. You see, for our God didn't need an earthly mediator. Our God was willing to rule and protect the Israelites from above, directly, without mediation. It was a setting apart. The people's desire for a king was a social norm. So, we have Samuel, and the people go to him and say, we want a king. Samuel, who is old, has two sons, very proud of his boys, already had arranged that his sons would take over whenever he moved on. He had faith and trust in God that everything would work out. And all of a sudden, he's confronted by people that say, that's not good enough. We want something different. And so he goes before God. Scriptures tell us he was displeased, and he shares his sorrows, his displeasure before God. He asks, I think, similar questions that we who long for social justice ask ourselves. These people, how long will they test me? Why can they just not listen to what I want? Why do they need to demand something? Why can they not trust you as I trust you, God? How long do I have to do this? Now, an interesting thing happens. Well, several interesting things happen. But the first interesting thing is God's reply. So God's reply to Samuel is, no, Samuel, they don't reject you, they reject me. And they have ever since they came out of the land of Egypt. They're continually worshiping their idols and their other gods, and they're dismissing me, rejecting me. And this is just who they are. And they do this to me as they do it to you. So now, for the academics in the room who like some Hebrew, so the word displeasure or displeased that is found is something to the effect of weira. Weira is used 11 times in the Hebrew scriptures and has been translated in other places, specifically in Genesis with Abraham, as distressed. So it could be interpreted, because it is a translation, that Isaac or Samuel was distressed and not necessarily just displeased. Same thing goes with the word reject that God responds to Samuel with. So reject was ma'asu, and that is used 12 times in the scriptures, and in other places says to despise. That's a whole nother level, right? The people despised God. So we have these words, displeased, rejected, despise, distress. These are not positive-go-lucky feelings, right? This is problematic. This is troublesome. We don't want to stay here, especially as followers of God. We want the love, we want the joy, we want the peace, and yet we find in this scene God in the midst of it. And in fact, as one commentary noted, it is God removing the rejection from Samuel as an act of saving Samuel from feeling that way and saying, no, Samuel, it's not you, it's really me. Put the burden onto me, not on you. You are doing what I am telling you. You are doing right and good. Put your exhaustion onto me. Now, there is a little bit of a contradiction if we pay careful attention to the language. Because you see, in the first part of that sentence, it says, no, Samuel, they reject me. But at the end of the sentence, it is read that they do to you as they do to me, as if both of us are being rejected. So there is a bit of a contradiction of, well, is God taking all of the rejection, or is Samuel taking some and just having to deal with it? I don't think it's an either or. I think it serves us best to think of it as a both and. That God is in the midst of our disheartenedness when we try and strive for social justice. The second lesson I think we can learn from this story is that God responds to Samuel's initial prayer. First sentence says, heed the words of the people and everything they say. He goes on God's sentences about rejection, and then he comes back and he says, heed the people's word. Then, what wasn't read to you either was verse 21 and verse 22, in which God ends the whole narrative by saying, heed the people's words, Samuel, give them a king. So multiple times, pretty much 3 times throughout this entire thing, from start, middle, and end, we have this phrase, heed the people's words. I wonder what that means for us as we struggle for a different vision than the reality in which we live. I wonder if that means that our call is not just to listen to those who we stand alongside or who we stand for behind us, but also we need to listen and engage with those across from us as well. You see, it's an interesting note that Samuel is not judged by God based on what the people of Israel do. Samuel is judged by God if Samuel listens to God. Perhaps as we yearn for social justice, it is about not an outcome, not getting what we want, but rather continuing on in the journey with small little victories as they come, and knowing that our progress is not up to us, and we're not evaluated and judged by that. Sometimes I think we We fear failure, and what have I spent my life for? If I die and this problem still exists, what has it met? That's not for you to decide. Just as much as it isn't if something does occur and change happens, be careful your pride does not get involved and your ego wrapped around that. Because that is not what God is calling us to do necessarily. It isn't outcome-based. It is the journey. It is the process and the progress we make as we delve deeper into our relationship with God. You see, as we struggle with the future, and there's no question that that report is not a victory and something we should rejoice upon this day, but we should be mindful that just because voices were heard today does not guarantee that the world will be as attentive tomorrow. We are just beginning down the road to reconciliation. We are just beginning down the road to redemption. God is waiting for us. Will you join God? Will you be there? Will you not give up?